Any questions?
Francis?
Just, excuse me, just give me 1 second. Yes?
Hi. It happens less and less, but today I had some feelings of fear and anxiety come up in the solar plexus and my gut. And I believe you've said that when it happens, to trace them back to their source. And I was trying to figure out how to do that. And all that occurred to me was to talk to them. And I actually did, in my mind, just had a conversation. And they said they came from my father when I was very young. Like something he said or did caused this fear. And it actually was very interesting because they expressed themselves and then they went away. But I was wondering if there's another way to trace them back that doesn't involve mind.
The story.
The story, exactly.
Yes. But this way is open only if we have recognized that consciousness is universal. And that it's for each of us to make this assessment. If that is the case, then as fear arises, we can remember that the only reason fear can possibly be there is because at that very moment we believe to be a separate consciousness. And as we connect the current situation of fear with our strong recognition of that consciousness is universal, then it collapses immediately. It cannot maintain itself. If it maintains itself, it means that there is still the belief that we are a separate entity. And then that is a good opportunity at that moment to resume the investigation. I think that's a better way, because if we try to listen to the fear, to welcome the fear with the hidden agenda to get rid of it. It's not welcoming. It is not, we are not in this moment really investigating. We are in the limited entity betterment business. So, whereas the investigation is the questioning of the reality of the limited entity. if we try to relieve, ameliorate, improve the limited entity, by the same token, we are not investigating its reality, right? If you are trying to make it better, it means that implicitly we are reaffirming its reality. The very fact that we try to, that's a huge difference there is, in fact, between the spiritual path and the self-improvement business.
I understand what you're saying, and honestly, I felt very welcoming. I mean, I was curious. I remember many times you say, be curious. And I was curious, so I was asking it questions.
So that's why it led you to some
story. Yes. So, okay, but if I were to take a different tack, and when I noticed that
But understand that it takes you to a story, however, you are not questioning the veracity of the story. Are you following me?
Yes. So my question...
So you are assuming, you are taking for granted the person whose dad said that at some point in the past. You see what I mean?
Yes, I do. So how would I then... What would be a good way to investigate? I seem to be a slow learner in the investigation.
No. The fear has, when it arises, will have all kinds of alleged causes. Like in this case, whatever the dad has told you. That's the alleged cause. But in fact, there is only one root cause to the fear, which is to accept to be a separate entity without questioning it. The only way is to question that relentlessly. I mean, every time it arises, because there is no evidence. So if we let it in unquestioned, that's an illegal alien in your country. So that ruins your happiness.
So what would it look like to question the fear?
Not the fear. The person who is afraid.
Okay. Would I do this in words? Would I do it wordlessly?
You may start with words, which are thoughts. But the thought will lead you to some place else. Because the thought you are going to use is the thought I.
So like, who am I?
Or any synonym of this thought. What I suggest is not that who am I, but what am I? And the first answer is that we come to I am consciousness. That's the first answer. Now, if you believe to be anything else than consciousness, then you are still stuck you are not ready for the big question. So you have to remain at that level until you are absolutely convinced that you are consciousness rather than a woman, rather than a human body, rather than anything else. That's the first, and that's not an obvious roadblock to overcome. And the way to overcome it is that I have to make a choice. Because there is a marked difference between the woman I believe to be, right, who has a size, a birth certificate, a name, a personal history, etc., and the consciousness who is hearing these words, who is invisible, doesn't have a size, doesn't have a birth certificate. Nobody was there when it was born to certify that there was no midwife there to write on a paper, consciousness was born on, I hereby certify. No. The baby was born, but the consciousness, there is no birth certificate. And our problem is that we believe that consciousness has a birth certificate. So I am a birther. About consciousness. I hope our friends in Europe follow the international stories.
Are you practicing for the talent show?
I'm not practicing. It all comes from in the moment and never comes again. So it's only one time, only once. Now, so that's the first step. We have to stay there until we are really convinced I am consciousness rather than the body. Because these are two different items, obviously. And one is not a usual item. Consciousness is very different. The other item is relatively common. Because like the computer, it has a color, it has a size, it has a location in space, in time, etc. It has all kinds of qualities that it shares with other objects.
Okay, so I've heard you say that we can't really know with the mind what we are. We can only know what we're not. Would you say that's correct?
Yes, but in fact, with the mind can know nothing. Only consciousness knows anything. When we say we can know with the mind, it's a kind of shorthand to express the mind only knows objects. That's shorthand for what the mind is really. It's objects. The mind is made of all perceptions. What the mind is mentations appearing in consciousness. So the mind is really a concept which is a generic term for the mentations. Because what we actually experience are mentations, right?
Yes.
We don't experience a mind. We experience mentations. These mentations appear to something which is stable, which is changeless, and which is utterly different from each of those mentations. I call that consciousness. And that's really the centrality of our human experience. The only thing that has never changed is the centrality of our human experience, in the same way as the axis of a wheel. The wheel moves, the axis is a motionless centrality of the wheel. So in the same way, the consciousness, the changeless consciousness, is the centrality of our human experience, in that sense that our human experience constantly changes. That's the wheel of karma, right? The wheel of activity. And the center of the wheel is the presence, the consciousness, which doesn't change. So that's, we first have to relate, when we ask the question, what am I? We first have to come up with this answer, I am consciousness. The centrality of what I am, centrality of my experience is consciousness. That has to be, I am giving it to you, you see what I mean, with words. As long as these words have not resonated in you as a yes, that's the case, you have to dig. You have to keep digging. And so that's the first step. That at some point we say, yes, I am consciousness, I'm not an object, I'm not the body, I am consciousness. Now, there is still left the possibility that this consciousness is dependent upon something else. Perhaps dependent upon the body, or dependent upon the universe, the physical universe. There are other possibilities, but even in this case, I first have to answer the question, what am I? So I am this consciousness. Up until that moment, I've not made any hypothesis as to whether this consciousness is limited, localized, in space or time, dependent upon the body, etc. Right? But I've made this first fundamental decision, I am consciousness. And then comes the second moment of the investigation, which is, now that I know I am consciousness, I'm asking myself, is there any evidence in my experience that this consciousness is limited, localized in space, in time, etc.? In my experience. Or, furthermore, is there any evidence at all? So then I could take a little step here, which would be moving from is there any evidence at all to is there any evidence in my experience? And here, which is already simplification of the question. Because if I ask myself the question, is there any evidence that consciousness is limited other than from my experience? It would be evidence that is available to somebody else. The question is, do they have any instrument of investigation in any experimental apparatus to make this determination that I don't have? You see? Do neuroscientists or philosophers, not in armchairs like this philosopher here, but philosophers, with PhDs, that's a good question. Does their PhD give them a special insight, experimental insight into consciousness that I don't have? It's a fair question, right? And the answer is?
No.
No. Right. Does the fact that they use fancy words, such as, I don't know, epoche, or Dasein, or whatever, give them any special insight that I don't have? The answer is no. They use these fancy words to get their PhD. That's the only reason why they use these fancy words. Because in this way they separate themselves from the armchair philosophers. and they become part of the elite, right? The elite who knows and who thinks everybody else is more stupid than they are. So, but that was a parenthesis, because I am being inspired. And I'm in defense of the armchair philosophers. You see, I like them. So, being one of them, I feel that I have to be their advocate. So, having made this determination, it becomes obvious that nobody else has more information about consciousness than I do. Right? Nobody else. Is that clear?
Yes.
Because nobody has special access. It's not the White House. Right?
Right.
It's different here. Nobody has special access. And so now the question has become, is there in my own experience of consciousness any evidence that this consciousness is separate, limited, that it was born, that it is localized here or there? You know? And that has to be also, you have to dig deeply. Every time you dig, it seems that you come to a wall. But in fact, this apparent negative result of your effort to investigate has led to a simplification of the question, because every time, you see, we start from a situation in which we believe there is evidence that consciousness is separate. In other words, our default state, if you will, is what we act from, what we think from, what we feel from is, I am a separate consciousness. So every time we ask the question, is there any evidence that I am a separate consciousness? And we don't find the answer. This apparently negative result has an impact on our belief that there is on our implicit belief that there is such evidence hidden somewhere, in some safe, in some bank, somewhere, under the mattress. But there is no evidence, you see? And as we keep reaching this apparent banging our head against this wall, apparently, this simplification, this erosion of our belief that, of our certainty that there is, that we are a separate consciousness, a limited consciousness, gets eroded. At some point we are completely open. But since our fear, the foundation of our fear was precisely this belief. As this belief gets eroded, our certainty gets eroded. The foundation of the fear also gets eroded. At some point, one wall collapses, then another wall, and then the roof is very unstable. So we have to, and this investigation, of course, has to take place not solely within the realm of concept, because that's for the PhD philosophers. The armchair philosophers, they don't limit the scope of their investigation to concepts. They are also interested in the body element of it, the feelings, the sensations. So that also, the irrational aspect, that also has to be investigated. But the question is, how do I know that this consciousness I know to be is limited. That's the question. How do I know? What is the evidence at any level?
That was really helpful. Thank you.